They stood at the edge of her field and laughed. Not behind her back, right to her face. Grown men, buyers who had done business with her family for 20 years, looked at rows of strange, twisted, unfamiliar vegetables and shook their heads. "This isn't a harvest," one of them said. "This is a joke." Grace Whitfield stood in the mud in her father's old boots, 38 years old, a widow, a mother of 2, and she said nothing. She just watched them walk away, climb into their trucks, and leave her standing alone with 3 acres of a crop nobody wanted. 12 months later, those same men would be standing in line outside her gate, checkbooks in hand, begging for a contract. This is the story of how a woman the whole town called foolish became the richest woman in the county in a single harvest season. And it started with the humiliation of her life. Stay with this story until the end, because what Grace Whitfield did with 3 acres of worthless crop is a lesson that has nothing to do with farming and everything to do with what happens when you stop asking people who have never believed in you for permission to succeed. Grace had grown up on this land. Whitfield Farm had belonged to her family for 3 generations, 400 acres of Iowa soil that had fed the county through droughts, recessions, and 2 wars. Her father, Earl Whitfield, had run it with corn and soybeans, the same 2 crops every single year, because that was what the land was supposed to grow. When Earl died of a heart attack in the equipment shed, Grace was 35 years old with a 9-year-old daughter, a 6-year-old son, and a mortgage her father had quietly taken out in his final years to keep the farm afloat. She hadn't known about the debt until the bank called 2 weeks after the funeral. Her husband, Daniel, had died 3 years before that. A car accident on a rain-slicked highway, coming home from a double shift at the plant. Grace had buried 2 of the most important men in her life before she turned 36, and now she was staring at a farm that was quietly, silently drowning. She remembered the night the police came to her door about Daniel. She remembered the smell of rain on the porch steps, the way the officer's hat sat in his hands instead of on his head, the way her daughter, only 6 at the time, asked why Mommy was crying in the kitchen at midnight. She remembered thinking, in the numb months afterward, that grief was supposed to have a bottom, a place where it stopped getting worse. She learned there wasn't one. There was just the next morning, and the next, and the children who still needed breakfast and clean clothes, and someone to tell them everything would be all right, even when she didn't believe it herself. 3 years later, when her father collapsed in the equipment shed with a wrench still in his hand, Grace found herself standing in a funeral home for the second time in her 30s, picking out a casket, shaking hands with men who kept saying the same hollow words. "He was a good man. He'll be missed. Let us know if you need anything." Nobody ever means that last part the way it sounds. Nobody ever actually comes when you call. The town of Millbrook was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, and kind enough on the surface, but underneath that kindness ran a current of judgment that Grace felt every single day. Poor Grace. Poor Whitfield girl. What's she going to do with that farm all alone? She heard it in the grocery store. She heard it dropped in half whispers at her children's school events. She heard it most of all in the silence that followed her into rooms, the way conversations paused just half a second too long when she walked in. For the first 2 years after her father's death, Grace did what everyone expected. She planted corn. She planted soybeans. She hired her father's old farmhand, Walt, a stubborn 60-year-old man who believed there was exactly one right way to farm, and it was the way his father had taught him. She went to the co-op meetings. She smiled and nodded when the men in the room talked over her. But the numbers never worked. Commodity prices were low. Input costs, seed, fertilizer, diesel, kept climbing. Every year she planted the same crop as 400 other farms in the county, and every year she got the same commodity price as everyone else, a price that barely covered what she'd spent to grow it. Walt would arrive every morning at 5:30, sip his coffee in silence on the porch, and then go about the day exactly as Earl Whitfield had taught him 30 years earlier, resistant to even small suggestions. When Grace once proposed rotating in a cover crop to improve the soil, Walt simply said, "Your daddy never did that," as if that settled the matter permanently. She learned quickly that changing anything on this farm meant fighting not just economics, but memory itself, the weight of a dead man's habits, treated as sacred law. At the co-op meetings, she sat in the back row while men twice her age discussed grain futures and equipment financing, and when she raised her hand to ask a question, she often watched the conversation move past her as if she hadn't spoken at all. One evening, after a meeting, an older farmer named Robert Dunmire patted her on the shoulder in the parking lot and said, not unkindly, "You're doing all right for a girl running things alone, Grace. Don't push too hard. Just keep her steady till you find yourself a new husband to take the load off." She smiled, thanked him, and cried in her truck for 10 minutes before driving home. By the third spring, the bank sent a letter. Not a warning, a countdown. If the farm didn't show a different financial picture within 18 months, Whitfield Farm would be foreclosed. Grace read the letter standing in the kitchen with flour still on her hands from making dinner, and she had to sit down at the table because her knees genuinely went weak beneath her. That night, Grace sat at her father's old kitchen table with her 2 children asleep upstairs, and she cried for the first time in months. Not because she was weak. Because she had run out of ideas that fit inside the box everyone told her farming had to be. She thought about selling the land outright and moving into town, taking a job at the diner or the school, giving her children a smaller but safer life. She almost convinced herself it was the responsible choice. But something in her, some stubborn thread inherited from her father, or maybe simply the refusal to let her children grow up believing their mother had given up, kept her sitting at that table long after midnight, staring at the walls of the only home she had ever truly known. And then, at 2 in the morning, staring at her father's dusty bookshelf, she found something that would change everything, an old, water-stained notebook her father had kept in the 1980s, full of notes about an heirloom crop he'd once experimented with and abandoned, a rare variety of purple corn and an unusual, deeply colored heirloom squash, both suited perfectly to their exact soil and climate, both nearly forgotten by modern industrial agriculture, and both, according to markets her father never had access to, worth 10 to 20 times more per pound than standard yellow corn. Her father had written one line at the bottom of the last page, underlined twice. "Nobody around here will buy it. Doesn't matter. Someone somewhere will." Grace sat on the floor of the study for nearly an hour, turning the brittle pages one by one. Her father had sketched crude drawings of the corn kernels in the margins, deep violet, almost black in places, and had pasted in a yellowed newspaper clipping about a seed bank in the eastern part of the state that preserved rare heirloom varieties. He had written pages of notes on soil pH, planting depth, pollination timing, harvest windows, all in his small, careful handwriting, the same handwriting that used to sign her school permission slips. It was strange and moving to realize her father had once been young and hopeful, and full of an idea nobody around him understood, 30 years before she would find herself standing in the exact same place. He had given up on the idea 30 years earlier because Millbrook had no way to sell anything except through the co-op, and the co-op only bought commodity crops at commodity prices. A neighbor at the time, Grace's father had written, laughed him out of the field almost the same way Grace herself would later be laughed at, and Earl Whitfield, proud, practical, and responsible for a young family, had quietly plowed the failed experiment under and gone back to corn and soybeans, the safe and expected choice, for the next 3 decades of his life. But the world Grace lived in was not the world her father had lived in. There were now direct markets, restaurants that wanted unique ingredients, health food distributors hungry for heirloom grains, farmers markets in cities 2 hours away where a single unusual vegetable could sell for more than an entire bushel of commodity corn, an entire internet full of buyers her father could never have reached from a rotary telephone in 1987. Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with a notebook open in front of her, a legal pad beside it, and began writing down every idea that came to her, crossing most of them out, circling a few. By sunrise, when her children came downstairs rubbing sleep from their eyes, she had a plan, reckless, unproven, and completely against everything Millbrook believed a farm was supposed to be. She looked at her son and daughter eating cereal at the counter and made herself a quiet promise. Whatever happened, she would not raise them to believe that fear was the same thing as wisdom. She told Walt first. He crossed his arms and told her flatly that in 40 years of farming he had never seen purple corn, had never heard of anyone buying novelty vegetables, and that she was about to bankrupt her father's legacy over a fantasy from an old notebook. She told the bank loan officer, hoping for a small operating loan to buy seed stock. He looked at her proposal, looked at her, and said the bank did not lend against unproven specialty crops, only against traditional commodities, with an established market price. He suggested she reconsider and plant corn like everyone else. She told her mother-in-law, who watched the children while Grace worked, and the older woman simply asked gently, "Grace, honey, what if it fails? What happens to the kids?" She even tried the county extension office, hoping an agricultural advisor might have resources or contacts for specialty crops. The young agent there, fresh out of a state university program, listened politely, tapped a few things into his computer, and told her that the office primarily supported established regional commodities, and that specialty heirloom production was, in his words, a hobbyist pursuit, not really a commercial strategy for a farm this size. He handed her a pamphlet about corn futures on her way out the door. Every door Grace knocked on gave her the same answer. This is foolish. This is not how it's done. Go back to what's safe. She began to understand that the resistance wasn't really about her specific plan at all. It was about the shape of the box everyone around her had agreed to live inside, a box built over generations, and how deeply threatening it feels to people when someone quietly steps outside of it, even if that person is only trying to survive. She didn't have the money for a loan anyway, not from a bank that refused her. So she did something that made the whole town talk for weeks. She sold her wedding jewelry, cashed out a small life insurance policy from Daniel's death that she had been saving for the children's college fund, and used almost every dollar of it to buy heirloom seed stock and rebuild 3 acres of her father's field by hand, with her own labor, alongside Walt, who grumbled the entire time but never actually left her side. Word got around fast in a small town. People drove past the field just to look at what the Whitfield widow was doing now. Some genuinely worried for her. Many mocked her outright. At the diner, at church, at the school pickup line, Grace heard the whispers, sometimes not even whispered. She's lost her mind. She's going to lose that whole farm over purple corn. Earl must be rolling in his grave. Her own son came home from school one afternoon in tears because another boy had told him his mother was planting garbage and that the Whitfield family was going to end up broke and homeless. Grace held him on the porch steps that evening, rocking him gently, and had to fight to keep her own voice steady while she told him that sometimes doing something different looks foolish to people right up until the moment it doesn't. She wasn't sure, in that moment, if she believed her own words. She said them anyway, because he needed to hear them, and because saying them out loud helped her believe them a little more each time. Even her closest friend, a woman named Patty who had known Grace since grade school, sat her down over coffee one Sunday and gently suggested that maybe, just maybe, grief had clouded her judgment, and that perhaps she should consider a more traditional path forward before it was too late to reverse course. Grace understood Patty meant well. That somehow made it hurt more, not less. When even the people who loved you most cannot see what you see, the loneliness of conviction becomes its own separate weight to carry, on top of everything else. The cruelest moment came in late spring, when 3 grain buyers from the regional co-op, the same men who had bought her father's harvest for 20 straight years, drove out to see the field for themselves. They stood at the fence line, looking at rows of unfamiliar sprouting plants, the twisted vines of the heirloom squash just beginning to climb, and one of them, a man named Kurt Hollis, laughed out loud. "This isn't a harvest," Kurt said. "This is a joke. You're going to starve out here playing farmer, Grace. Come fall, you come back and plant something real, and maybe we'll still do business with you." The other 2 men with Kurt didn't laugh outright, but they exchanged a look that was somehow worse. A look of pity, the kind reserved for someone everyone has quietly already given up on. One of them, a younger buyer named Pete, almost said something kinder, opened his mouth as if to offer some small encouragement, then seemed to think better of it in front of Kurt and stayed silent instead. Grace stood in the mud in her father's old boots and said nothing. She watched them get in their trucks and drive away, dust rising behind them on the gravel road, and she stood there alone at the fence for a long time afterward, long enough that Walt eventually walked over from the barn and stood beside her without speaking, which was, for Walt, its own quiet form of loyalty. That night, alone in the farmhouse after the kids were in bed, she almost gave up. She sat with her father's notebook in her lap and thought about the mortgage, the seed money she'd already spent, her children's future, and the very real possibility that Kurt Hollis was right. But then she thought about her father's underlined sentence. Someone, somewhere, will. She opened her laptop instead of closing the notebook, and she started doing something none of the men who mocked her had ever bothered to do. She went looking for the someone, somewhere. Grace spent every night after the children were asleep researching markets nobody in Millbrook had ever touched. She learned about farm-to-table restaurants in Chicago and Minneapolis that paid premium prices for rare heirloom vegetables, with a real story behind them. She learned about specialty grain mills that turned heirloom corn into artisanal flour and cornmeal, sold at 10 times the commodity price. She learned about food bloggers, chefs, and small distributors who were desperate for authentic, traceable, small farm ingredients, and who had no idea a farm like hers even existed. She built a simple website with her daughter's help, using photos she took herself in the golden evening light over the fields. She wrote the real story, her father's old notebook, her husband's death, the bank's countdown, the gamble she was taking, because she instinctively understood something the corporate co-op never could. People don't just buy food, they buy the story behind the food. Late at night, long after the farm work was done and the children were asleep, Grace taught herself things she had never expected to learn at 38 years old: how to write a compelling email, how to research a restaurant supply chain, how to read a shipping and logistics guide, how to calculate cost per pound against a specialty market price instead of a commodity price. She made mistakes constantly. She sent one early email so poorly worded that a chef wrote back only a single line: "Not interested, but good luck." She kept the email in a folder she privately called Fuel, a reminder of exactly what she was working against. She cold emailed 40 restaurants. 37 never replied, but 3 did. One was a small, well-reviewed farm-to-table restaurant in Minneapolis, run by a chef named Elena Cortez, who had spent years searching for exactly the kind of heirloom purple corn Grace's father had once written about. Elena's email back was longer than the others, full of genuine curiosity, asking detailed questions about soil composition, pollination method, and whether Grace had any photographs of the plants at their current growth stage. Grace stayed up until 2 in the morning answering every question in full, attaching photos she'd taken that same afternoon. 2 weeks later, Elena drove 3 hours from Minneapolis to see the field in person, something none of the local buyers had ever bothered to research even though they lived 20 minutes away. She walked the rows with Grace in the early evening light, running her fingers along the husks, asking about the soil, the water, the timing of planting. She tasted a sample ear of the young corn raw, right there in the field, closed her eyes, and went quiet for a long moment. "Do you know what you have here?" Elena asked. Grace shook her head, half expecting more mockery, bracing herself out of old habit. "This is one of the rarest corn varieties left in the Midwest," Elena said. "Most farms let it die out 40 years ago because it doesn't yield like hybrid corn, and yield is all the industrial system has ever cared about. But the flavor, Grace, I could build a menu around this. My customers pay extra for exactly this kind of story and exactly this kind of taste. Nobody else in 3 states is growing it properly anymore." Grace had to turn away for a moment and press the back of her hand to her eyes, because after 2 years of being told her instincts were foolish, hearing a stranger confirm what her father had believed 30 years earlier felt almost unbearably vindicating. Elena placed a standing order that day. Every ear of purple corn and every squash Grace could grow that season, at a price nearly 15 times what the co-op paid for commodity corn. It wasn't enough on its own to save the farm, but it was proof. Proof that her father's underlined sentence had been right all along. Grace used that first contract as leverage. She reached out to a specialty flour mill in Wisconsin with Elena's order as proof of demand, and secured a second contract to buy her surplus corn for stone-ground heirloom cornmeal. She partnered with a regional co-op of small organic grocers who wanted her squash for their fall-produce boxes. Slowly, deal by deal, email by email, phone call by phone call, Grace built something no one in Millbrook believed was possible, a direct market, entirely outside the commodity system that had trapped her father for 30 years. It was not easy. The heirloom crop was finicky and unpredictable, nothing like the forgiving hybrid corn Walt had grown his entire life. A late frost in May nearly wiped out a quarter of the young plants, and Grace and Walt spent 3 sleepless nights covering rows by hand with old bedsheets and tarps, working by flashlight in the freezing dark, racing the sunrise, both of them too exhausted to speak but too stubborn to stop. When the sun finally came up on the 3rd morning and most of the plants had survived, Walt looked out over the field, wiped his face with his sleeve, and said quietly, "Your daddy would have covered them the same way." It was the closest thing to approval he had given her in 2 years, and Grace held on to it for weeks afterward. A local rival farmer named Dale Pruitt, resentful of the attention Grace's gimmick was getting in the county paper, began telling people at the feed store that her unlicensed produce wasn't safe to eat, hinting darkly about chemicals and contamination with absolutely no evidence behind the claim. The rumor reached one of Grace's smaller buyers, who nervously paused an order pending clarification. Furious and frightened in equal measure, Grace spent money she genuinely did not have to get formal organic certification and independent lab testing, driving 2 hours each way to a certified facility because nothing closer would take a rush order. The wait for results was one of the longest weeks of her life. The testing came back not only clean, but exceptional. Her heirloom corn showed significantly higher antioxidant and mineral content than standard commodity corn, a detail Elena Cortez seized on immediately for her restaurant's menu description. What Dale Pruitt had intended as a wound became, in the end, one of Grace's strongest marketing assets. Grace never confronted him about it publicly. She didn't need to. The lab report spoke for itself, and word of his failed rumor spread through Millbrook nearly as fast as the rumor itself had. There were smaller defeats too, the kind nobody writes articles about. A shipment of squash arrived damaged at a distributor's warehouse due to a packing mistake Grace hadn't yet learned to avoid, costing her nearly a week's expected profit from that order. Her old farm truck broke down twice during the season's busiest weeks, forcing her to borrow Walt's pickup and rearrange delivery schedules by hand at midnight. Her daughter got sick with a bad flu in the middle of the harvest push, and Grace spent 2 nights split between the hospital waiting room and her laptop, refusing to let either responsibility fail. Every setback nearly broke her. Every single time, she thought of her children upstairs asleep, thought of Kurt Hollis's laugh at the fence line, thought of Dale Pruitt's rumors at the feed store, thought of her father's underlined words on that water-stained page, and she kept going. Not because she was certain of success. Because she had already decided that giving up would hurt worse than failing. By late summer, word had begun to spread beyond Millbrook. A regional food magazine ran a story about the Iowa widow reviving a lost heirloom crop, featuring Elena's restaurant and Grace's story side by side. The article went further than anyone expected, picked up by a larger food publication, then shared thousands of times online, with photos of Grace standing in her purple corn field at sunset, her children beside her. Suddenly the emails poured in. Restaurants across 3 states wanted contracts for the next season. A regional supermarket chain interested in story-driven local products reached out about carrying her cornmeal and squash in dozens of stores. A food investor even offered to help her scale production onto additional acreage the following year, in exchange for a modest equity stake. Harvest season arrived in early October, and it was unlike anything Millbrook had ever seen on the Whitfield farm. Trucks lined the gravel road, not co-op grain trucks, but refrigerated delivery vans from restaurants and distributors, all coming to collect their contracted orders directly from Grace's field. The sound of it, engines idling along a road that had been silent for years, drew neighbors out onto their porches just to watch. Volunteers, neighbors, even a few of the same people who had once whispered about her, came out to help with the harvest, drawn by curiosity and, quietly, by respect. Patty showed up on the first morning with a thermos of coffee and gloves, saying only, "Put me to work," and Grace hugged her without a word, both women understanding the apology folded inside the gesture. Robert Dunmeyer, the older farmer who had once told her to find a new husband, sent his 2 grown sons over for 3 days of harvest labor, refusing payment, telling Grace simply that he'd underestimated her and wanted to make it right in the only language farmers really trust: work. Even Grace's son, now 8 years old, spent afternoons after school in the field beside her, small hands sorting squash into crates, proud in a way that made Grace's chest ache every time she looked at him. Her daughter, 12 now, ran the laptop and the phone from the kitchen table, confirming deliveries and fielding calls from distributors with a calm competence that startled every adult who spoke with her. Grace worked alongside Walt, her children, and a small crew she'd finally been able to hire, pulling in the largest and most valuable harvest Whitfield farm had produced in 3 generations. The days blurred together. Sunrise starts, dirt under every fingernail, the ache in her lower back that never fully left, and beneath all of it, a quiet, disbelieving joy she hadn't let herself feel in years. When the final numbers were tallied at the end of that harvest season, the restaurant contracts, the mill contract, the grocery chain deal, and a wave of direct online orders that had come in after the magazine article, Grace sat at her father's kitchen table with her accountant on a video call, watching the final total appear on her laptop screen. Whitfield Farm's small 3-acre gamble had generated over $1.2 million in revenue in a single season, on land the bank had once called worthless collateral and buyers had once called a joke. She closed the laptop, walked out onto the porch alone, and stood there for a long time in the cold October air, looking out over a field that had, 12 months earlier, been the site of the worst humiliation of her life. She didn't cry exactly. It was something quieter than that, a long, slow exhale, the kind that comes only after you've been holding your breath for far longer than you realized. The woman the bank had refused to lend to. The woman Kurt Hollis had called a joke. The woman half the town had quietly pitted at the diner and the school pickup line. She had turned a rejected harvest into a fortune, not through luck, but through a father's forgotten notebook, a widow's desperate courage, and the simple refusal to accept that the way it's always been done was the only way it could be done. The following spring, Kurt Hollis came back to Whitfield Farm. Not to mock her this time. To ask if the co-op could handle overflow distribution for her expanding heirloom crop, now that Grace was scaling up to 12 acres and hiring 3 additional full-time workers. Grace met him at the same fence line where he had once laughed in her face, the same mud underfoot, though it seemed impossibly long ago now. Kurt shifted his weight, uncomfortable in a way she had never once seen him during their 20 years of business with her father. He mentioned, almost as an apology without quite saying the word, that he hadn't expected any of this, that nobody had. Grace didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply told him her terms, calmly, the way a woman does when she no longer needs anyone's permission to succeed. Fair pricing. A real contract, not a handshake. Payment terms that respected the actual cost of what she grew. Kurt agreed to every one of them without argument, and as he drove away that day, Grace noticed he didn't look back through the mirror the way he had the first time, dust rising behind a truck that no longer had the power to make her feel small. Dale Pruitt never apologized outright, but the following winter, at a community fundraiser, he approached her table, cleared his throat, and asked, almost shyly, whether she considered sharing what she'd learned about direct markets sometime, since his own corn and soybean prices had been rough the last 2 years. Grace looked at him for a long moment, thought about the loud bill his rumor had cost her, and then said simply, "Sure, Dale. Come by sometime." Forgiveness, she was learning, cost her nothing, and giving it freed something in her that resentment never could have. The bank that had refused her a loan sent a letter that spring too, an offer, this time, for a generous line of credit to help her expand further, citing her impressive financial turnaround. Grace read the letter standing at the same kitchen counter where, 2 years earlier, she had received the foreclosure countdown, and the symmetry of it was not lost on her. She folded the new letter neatly, set it aside, and decided, for now, that she didn't need their money after all. She would consider expansion capital on her own terms, when and if she wanted it, not because a bank had finally decided she was worth the risk. She paid off her father's mortgage in full that year, walking into the same branch that had once refused her, and handing over a cashier's check large enough that the young teller had to call a manager over just to confirm the transaction. She set aside the money for her children's education that she had once gambled away on seed stock, rebuilding it several times over, and then adding more on top, determined that neither of her children would ever face the kind of financial fear she had carried for 2 straight years. She hired Walt on, with a real salary and a share of future profits, formalizing what had always, in practice, been a full partnership. The old man who once told her she was ruining her father's legacy now told anyone who would listen, at the feed store, at church, at the co-op meetings he still occasionally attended out of habit, that Grace Whitfield was the finest farmer he had ever worked beside, including her father, a comparison he had never once made about anyone in 40 years of farming. Grace kept that particular compliment close, turning it over in her mind on hard days, because she knew exactly how much it had cost Walt's pride to say it. She also did something nobody expected. She set aside a portion of that first $1 million season to start a small fund, informally at first, to help other struggling local farms experiment with alternative crops and direct markets, the exact kind of support she had gone without. 2 families in the county took her up on it that first year. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because she remembered, more clearly than she remembered almost anything else, exactly what it felt like to stand at a fence line completely alone. And on the wall of the farmhouse kitchen, in a simple wooden frame, Grace hung a single page torn gently from her father's old notebook, the page with his underlined words. Not as a trophy. As a reminder, for herself and for her children, of the moment everyone told her she was worthless, and the season, one single harvest season, when she proved that the only person who ever truly needed to believe in her was herself. Years later, when people in Millbrook told the story of Grace Whitfield, they rarely got the details exactly right. Some said she'd inherited money from a distant relative. Some said a corporation had discovered her land and bought her out for a fortune. The truth, quieter and harder than either version, rarely survived the retelling. A widow with 2 children and a dead man's mortgage had simply refused to accept that the only way to farm was the way it had always been done, and had worked, and researched, and failed, and tried again, one exhausting season at a time, until the world finally caught up to what her father had known 30 years too early. Grace herself never much cared for the mythology that grew up around her name. When local reporters or curious visitors asked what her secret was, she gave them the same honest answer every time. There was no secret. There was a notebook nobody had bothered to read for 30 years, a mortgage deadline that terrified her into action, and a decision, made in the loneliest hour of her life, to stop asking people who had already given up on her for permission to keep going. Her daughter, now in her 20s, went on to study agricultural business, drawn directly by watching her mother build something from nothing at the kitchen table. Her son stayed on the farm, working the fields beside Walt's eventual successor, carrying forward a legacy his grandfather had abandoned and his mother had resurrected. Whitfield Farm, once a single crop clinging to survival on 400 flat acres of Iowa soil, became something none of the men who once laughed at the fence line could have predicted. A name buyers across the Midwest actively sought out. A small, but thriving multi-generational business built not on luck, but on the willingness of one exhausted, grieving, determined woman to plant something the whole world told her was worthless. They said her harvest was worthless. They said it to her face, at the edge of a muddy field, in front of a crop nobody understood. They said it in bank offices, in extension office pamphlets, in whispered conversations at the diner and the school pickup line. They said it with laughter, with pity, and sometimes, worst of all, with kindness, the kind of gentle discouragement that comes from people who genuinely believe they are protecting you from disappointment. One harvest season later, that same field had made her a millionaire, not because the world suddenly changed its mind about her, but because she stopped waiting for the world's permission and planted something worth believing in. The corn didn't change. The soil didn't change. What changed was that Grace Whitfield finally trusted a truth her father had written down 30 years before she needed it, that worth is not decided by the people standing closest to you at your lowest moment. It is decided by the size of the world you're willing to look for, once you stop accepting the smallest possible answer. Somewhere tonight, there is another Grace Whitfield, standing at the edge of her own field, maybe not literally a field, maybe a business plan, a manuscript, an idea scribbled on a napkin, listening to someone laugh at what she's trying to build. Maybe it's a bank that won't lend her the money. Maybe it's a family member who means well, but can't see past their own fear. Maybe it's the quiet voice inside her own head, the one that sounds suspiciously like every person who has ever doubted her. To her, and to anyone who has ever been told their harvest was worthless, plant it anyway. Someone, somewhere, will understand its value, even if no one in your own town ever does. Sometimes it takes a notebook nobody read for 30 years. Sometimes it takes a deadline that terrifies you into finally moving. Sometimes it just takes one single, ordinary, back-breaking season to prove every doubter completely and permanently wrong. Grace Whitfield didn't get rich because the world was fair to her. She got rich because, at the exact moment the world told her to give up, she chose, instead, to dig one more row. The end.